Excel has several functions that can create a series of numbers for you, and these can be either totally randomized or a little bit more specifically chosen. So here's how these family of functions work. First, we have the essential random generator, just called RAND. Now, the RAND function, interestingly, does not generate whole numbers at all. It only generates random decimal values. And you cannot specify anything at all with the RAND function. You just tell it to generate some numbers, and it will generate random decimal numbers between 0 and 1. So pretty clearly here, the function RANDBETWEEN is a step up usually, because RANDBETWEEN allows you to say there's a low side and a high side to the numbers that are going to be generated. And here, it's actually only going to generate integer values for you. Now, you can use this to generate decimals if you need to, but you just need to multiply it by a decimal value of some kind. Then we get into the two newer functions that are dynamic array functions. So we have the RAND array, which generates random values in an array. And you can see here that you can specify not only the low and the high end of this random array, but you can give it a size, a certain number of rows and columns that this is made up of. And you can tell it whether it's important or not that this is an integer value, meaning a whole number, or just go ahead and use decimal numbers. And then finally, I'm including the sequence function in this video too. Even though it's not a random generator, what it does allow you to do is create a sequence of numbers, which is often really all we're really going for. And so the sequence function, very similarly to the RAND array function, allows you to specify a number of rows, a number of columns, a starting number, and then this is important, it doesn't let you specify the top end of the range, but instead tells you to specify the step. How big of a step should we take at each part of the sequence? So if we see these in some real-world scenarios, let's take a look first at the RAND function. Now you'll notice here that I've preset a little table over on the right-hand side with decimal numbers between 0 and 0.9, and I've set that each one of those is specified to a particular table. And you can also see in here that I have an XLOOKUP function that is finding the closest value without going over, and right now everything is just defaulting to table number 10. But now if I go into the value cell here, cell E6, I can go to the Formulas tab at the top of the screen to the Math and Trig function dropdown, but really I'm just looking for the RAND function here, and I could have also hand typed this very easily. I choose it and click OK, and that generates a number between 0 and 1. And if I autofill that down, you can see that because I have all of this set up ahead of time, now we have a random assignment of each of these people to various tables. And because the RAND function is intended to give you a pretty even distribution between 0 and 1, we can use this as our starting point for what tables everybody's assigned to. And here you can see, for example, that a number like 0.11 is just over that 0.1 range, and so it assigns that person to table 2. Now, I typically prefer to use the RANDBETWEEN function because it allows you to actually specify the bottom and tops of the range. In this instance, you can see here that I have a lookup function, an index function, that allows me to retrieve the first name, last name, etc. for a randomly selected person. Now here, I have the number 5 hard-coded into cell K5, but if I want this to be randomly generated, I can use the Math and Trig drop-down menu and find the RANDBETWEEN function. RANDBETWEEN, like I said, has a bottom and a top. Now here we want to lock in the bottom value as 1 because we want to be able to retrieve technically the first person on this list, Daniel here. But if I don't really want to pay attention to how many entries there are, for the top, what I can do is use the count A function and simply highlight all the cells in this column. And what that'll do is tell you how many entries are in the table. So this will dynamically choose a number between 1 and 31, which is how many entries there are. So now when I click OK, it's going to generate a random number between 1 and 31 and retrieve Gloria Collins or anybody else. When you're using these random number generators, remember that you can either use the Calculate Now button on the Formulas tab or press the keyboard shortcut F9 to randomly generate new values. Now let's look at a scenario where RANDARRAY could help us out. Here I have a lookup that uses what's called the small function. I want to retrieve the 4 smallest numbers and use that to retrieve the right person's name. So with this calculation right here, where we're saying use the index to retrieve the first name of whatever the smallest position is, and then here the second smallest position, and then here the third smallest position, all I've got to do is click into cell C6 and enter a function for the RANDARRAY. Now here, because RANDARRAY does specify how many rows we're talking about, you kind of have to know ahead of time. Here you can see that we have the count of 35. So we go Math and Trig, RANDARRAY, 35 rows, and 1 column, with a minimum value of 1. And then here, because what I'm trying to do is randomly generate a list of 4 people, the one thing I don't want is for there to be a lot of duplications. So I'm going to have this randomly generate a number between 1 and, let's say, I don't know, that number. I don't even know how many zeros I put in. But what this sort of guarantees is there's a lot lower likelihood that 2 people will end up with the number 5. If I say generate a random number between 1 and 35, there are almost certainly going to be some duplicates here. Now further, we don't really have to specify whether this is an integer or a decimal value, whether it's a whole number or a decimal value. And in fact, if we allow for decimals, that means that there's even less likelihood that there's any chance at all for a duplicate. So we'll leave this empty, meaning that it will be set to a decimal number, and we click OK, and that generates 35 random numbers. And because of the lookups that I set up over here, you can see that Guy Lu has the smallest of those numbers, followed by Dakota Powers, Teresa von Berg, and Qi Cheng. Now, like I said, for our last function, we're going to add an honorary random number generator in the form of the sequence function. It doesn't actually generate random numbers, but rather a sequence of numbers that we specify. So here, everybody, I am going to use this to generate a sequence of the next few Mondays, for example. So here in my spreadsheet, I have a calculation that if today's date is 3/12 of 2025, then it's the next Monday is 3/17 of 2025, and then I'd like to start from 3/17 of 2025 and put in, let's say, the next 10 Mondays here. So I go to cell C9, I go to the Math and Trig drop-down menu, and I grab the sequence function. The sequence function, again, asks how many rows and how many columns I want to generate. So if I wanted 10 Mondays, I'll put in 10 for the number of rows, but for the number of columns, just 1. And then here, the starting number. The first piece you need to understand here is that dates at the end of the day are just numbers. So we can say that the starting number is 3/17 of 2025. And then for the step, well, I want the next Monday, which is, of course, 7 days in the future. So I will step up every 7 days, just like that. And when I click OK, sure enough, 317, 324, 331, etc. So now I've generated basically a little calendar for myself to fill in with all these hybrid office assignments.